This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York State ASBO webinar, Performance Evaluations and Improvement Plans. Our speakers for today are Jeffrey Gordon and Mary Ellen Valancourt. If you have questions at any time, please feel free to use the chat pane to the right of the main screen. Or if you'd like to ask a question over the phone, you can hit 7# on your handset, and that'll notify me that you have a question. I'll then put you through. Without any further questions here, please, Jeffrey, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everyone around the state for joining us today. Both Mary Ellen and I are going to be presenting information regarding performance evaluations and performance improvement plans. We also have, we'll have two guests in our room here at Fayetteville Manlius School District. Tracy Noble is here. She is our superintendent's administrative assistant, but she is also an extensive background in personnel. And also Greg Avellino, who is our associate principal at the high school. The reason for that is we thought it might be useful to have some people here who have not heard our presentation before, and maybe we'll have some questions that we could answer and have it be a little bit more like a true dialogue rather than us just presenting the information and waiting for you to type questions in. Having said that, we certainly encourage you to type in your questions as much as we want this to be a very free-form opportunity for you. So I'm going to, this is a new experience for us, by the way, so we apologize if it seems like it. Fayetteville Manlius, for those of you who don't know, is located right outside of Syracuse, New York. Let's start by going over some of the goals of this session. What we hope to accomplish today is to review the various types of performance evaluations that districts use, primarily as it relates to non-instructional employees. We want to talk a bit about the importance of gathering evidence to use during your performance evaluations versus opinions. That's a pretty hot topic around the state right now. We also want to talk a bit about the evaluation conferences and give you some of our opinions on some best practices when it comes to the evaluation conferences. We want to talk to you a bit about when it's time to consider an improvement plan for an employee. We also want to hopefully help answer the question of when a counseling memorandum is more appropriate versus an improvement plan. What's the difference between the two? And then we want to go through some of the key components of an improvement plan. Before we begin, and we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves, make sure you know who's here, but I did want to say that I know there are a lot of people out there who have as much experience as we do in this, so we don't see ourselves as the experts in this arena, but we certainly have quite a few years of experience, as I'm sure you do as well, and would welcome not only your questions but your comments, and know that every district does things a little bit differently, so we're certainly not implying that our way of thinking is necessarily the best way, but we hope that you get a few ideas out of this session. So first, a little about us. I'm going to have Mary Ellen Valancourt tell you a little bit about herself.
Okay, presently, I've been supervisor of personnel at Fayetteville Manlius School District since 1993. And my primary focus is non-instructional personnel and civil service. I also am involved with benefits and payroll issues as they come up. And prior to coming to FM, I also worked for the county for 13 years. 10 of the years I worked with employment and training opportunities. Jeff?
Mine's not as exciting. I have been the assistant superintendent for personnel here at Fayetteville Manlius my 5th year. Prior to that, I was at the Janesville DeWitt School District, which is a neighboring school district, and I was assistant superintendent for educational services there. But having spent 13 years in that district, I had a variety of roles, starting as a 4th grade teacher, and then as curriculum coordinator, director of personnel, and also an elementary principal. So I've had a lot of different roles. And here at Fayetteville Manlius, just to explain, we're very fortunate, and I know some of you, when you hear this, might be salivating, that we have both an assistant superintendent for personnel and a supervisor of personnel. So just to be clear of the roles and responsibilities, Mary Ellen really does much more of the non-instructional work, interacting with civil service frequently and all those kinds of things. My job here is primarily focused on the instructional end and administrative end of the work. It's not to say they don't overlap both ways. They do, quite a bit.
Definitely.
And when there are larger discipline issues in the non-instructional arena, I'm always involved in some fashion. So, but I'm glad that Mary Ellen was able to be here with me today because she certainly has more upfront and personal experience dealing with the non-instructional employees. Okay. So let's start off by talking about performance evaluations. And before we talk about the kinds of performance evaluations that you see in the school districts around New York State, we should probably start by answering the question, why? Why do we have performance evaluations? Why do we do them? And I'm going to steal a line because I'm from Eric Wilson, who is one of our school attorneys, and I know he provided a great webinar earlier in the year. And but I'm not sure he wrote this either. He may have stole this too. But he has a little saying, it's G-E-G-O-G-E-G, or giggle-gag, and basically G-E-G-O-G-E-G stands for get 'em good or get 'em gone. It's a little harsh, but he is an attorney, so we would expect that from them, right? Basically, it's important to note that there are really two reasons. Performance appraisals and performance evaluations really do serve two purposes. The first one, and most important one, we hope, is to help employees continually grow and improve, to point out the areas where they're doing extremely well, and then to help them with areas that they need some further assistance in. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read to you from our teacher's contract, and it lists the purpose of evaluation as follows. The purposes of observation are improvement of instruction and evaluation of performance. By its nature, the observation process engages teachers and administrators in a dialogue about teaching and learning, promotes professional development, and encourages teachers' self-reflection in assessing their own performance. Both observation and evaluation of teachers shall be continuous. Evaluation of work and performance included judgments resulting from both formal and informal observations. All formal observation of work and performance will be conducted openly with full knowledge of the teacher. Well, you could take out teacher and all of that and put the name of the non-instructional person we're speaking of, and it would mean the same thing. So the bottom line is it's always about the improvement of performance, and it's a process that we go through to help the system improve by providing feedback to our employees. That's the first reason. But the second reason is that unfortunately on occasion we have people who we need to document where their areas of deficiency are and show that we've made every attempt to help them improve. And that's really what today's session is all about. It's about the evaluation of our employees for that reason primarily. So I wanted to also mention before we begin that I found it kind of interesting as I was preparing for this that I looked at the summary of New York State Civil Service Law, and it's a fairly new document, and I know it's new because it has Governor Cuomo's name on it. And the only place in this entire document where it speaks to evaluations of any kind or feedback of any kind is under a section for probationary employees called Probationary Reports. And it basically talks about the requirement that the supervisor carefully observe and conduct the performance, in this case of the probationary appointee, and provide information at least 2 weeks before the end of the term. That's the only place within the Civil Service Summary where it really speaks to that, which means that it falls on the school districts, in our case school districts, to come up with protocols for evaluating our non-instructional employees. Some of you may have those protocols in your collective bargaining agreements, and that's one place you really want to look and make sure you have those. Some of you, like Fable Manlius, for example, we do not have it in our collective bargaining agreements. And ours is really more of a practice that we have, which is good and bad, I suppose. It could be, it's good, but it also, it means we have more freedom perhaps than if it was in a collective bargaining agreement. But it also means that it's incumbent upon us to make sure that the process is very clear so that we can't be called out later and in a hearing or elsewhere and saying, you know, you have a very fluid evaluation system that allows some people different protocols than others. No, we don't do that. We have a very set way of doing it, right, Mary Ellen?
That's correct, and we do have a once-a-year review. Each department has set up a process on how they schedule those reviews to make sure they're complete. Our custodial department, for example, most of the departments go by the school year with our 10-month employees prior to the end of the year. Custodial, we have a large number of individuals, and the supervisors found it more helpful to them to keep to an anniversary schedule. So that's how they tag out their people. So it's a set process, and it's done consistently on an annual basis.
So again, you might have it through a collective bargaining agreement. You might have it listed, as we do, more as a set protocol that's been in place for quite some time here. You might find it in your work rules that you have. Now, if you do have it in a collective bargaining agreement or in your work rules, some of the things you might expect to see in there related to performance evaluations include the number of evaluations that are required. Sometimes that might be written as a minimum. That would be preferred for the district to have it written as a minimum so that you can go in as much as you feel you need to conduct evaluations on an employee. The timing of the evaluations, which Mary Ellen just spoke to ours here. Issues related to pre- and post-observation meetings, including are they required, are they not required, are they, what's the format of them, who can attend, those kinds of issues. You also find in some contracts that it might even specify who is allowed to evaluate a teacher and, evaluate an employee, and who is not allowed to evaluate an employee. So all those things are possibilities, and you want to make sure that you're very familiar with the protocols that are in place in your district, because again, if we're talking about eventually perhaps having to go seek disciplinary action and it's going to be heard by a hearing officer, those are some of the things they're going to check for, where the first thing they're going to look to see if you made any missteps in the process. If you did, it's a bad way to start a hearing. So make sure you know those very well and you adhere to those. Now, which leads us to the kinds of evaluations that you see in different districts. Hopefully, you'll look at some of these and you'll say, that's the kind we have. If you have something completely different, go ahead and type it into us. We'd love to see it. But basically, there are really two kinds of evaluations that are used, and then there's a whole bunch of hybrids of the two. The first one is a criterion-based, and that's basically a list of discrete job requirements. And usually, you have a specific rating scale that goes along with that. We're going to show you an example of one of those in just a minute. Then there's the narrative. It requires the evaluator to provide either one long narrative of an employee's performance or several shorter narratives under a section or a question. And we have an example of that as well. So what are the differences? The difference is that with a criterion-based evaluation, which I find in the non-instructional realm to be more common, the job requirements are very easily spelled out by what the discrete topics are that are placed on that evaluation. So it's pretty easy to see what the job requirements are just by filling out the evaluation. evaluation tool. When you're working with a narrative, it's much more difficult. They're just broad questions or sections, and they ask the evaluator to have a really good understanding of that person's job so that they can write about in a clear way what they're seeing in those areas. Sometimes attaching the job description to the narrative is a good idea, especially if you're a supervisor that's overseeing a lot of different jobs. Always remember that in the absence of a locally written job description, your county civil service job description should be used. So good news, bad news, I suppose, is that your county has their own civil service department. That would be a whole nother webinar if you wanted my opinion on county civil service. But I don't know if any of them are listening right now, so I better keep quiet. But they do have job descriptions for all of their jobs. The downside of those job descriptions, as you know, if you've seen them, is that sometimes they are fairly long, and sometimes they're vague, and sometimes they don't perfectly fit exactly what you're hoping your job will have as their responsibility. So I would make a recommendation that if you don't have job descriptions in your district and you're relying on the civil service job descriptions, I guess if they're working great for you, then never mind. But my recommendation would be that it's worth the time to develop your own job descriptions so that there's no confusion later about which part of the job is in and which part of the job is out. It's always better to have your own local documents that address your needs, allowing for the fact that obviously it needs to stay under in some broad way, some general way, can't be completely the opposite of what the civil service job description says. It has to have some connection to it.
And I think sometimes if you are developing your own job descriptions, what you can do is start with the county description and just bring that down, make it more specific and pertinent to your district, but following the same general steps. Sometimes that's a quick way to get it done and fairly accurate. The only thing that we've made a decision to do in this district, we have the ability to transfer individuals from job to job and different buildings. So we do try and keep our descriptions broad enough so that we don't get challenged by changing somebody's job description. So they're specific to the district, but they may not, we try and keep them broad enough to just keep that fluctuation in positions where we can move people around easily.
Yeah. In my former place of employment, Janesville DeWitt, we used the civil service job descriptions quite a bit, and that caused a whole host of small problems, not major problems, but small problems. So I can't stress enough that if you're a district that did what my former employer did, and I loved my former employer, I'm not putting them down, but I think there is a benefit to having your own locally written expectations, because the clearer they are, the better for the employee and the employer. All right, I pulled this offline, but I think it's a pretty good example of what you would expect to see in a criterion-based evaluation form. On the left side of the document, you can see that basically, again, there's those fairly discrete statements regarding the job that you could, for many of them, put together, and you could see very clearly what the job is that, in this case, a custodian is being asked to do. And then on the right side, you can see that for, in this case, it looks like there are 4 different ratings that, I'm sorry, I'm being distracted by my business manager. Mike Vespi, ladies and gentlemen. There's a key at the top, and there are 4 basic rating scales. And this is truly a very basic model. This is about as criterion-based as you can get. It gives no descriptions of what those 4 would be. And so basically a supervisor is going through and checking one of those 4 boxes on the right, and it doesn't appear, based on the information we have here, that they really have an opportunity to explain why they chose what they chose. So on the one hand, it's clear cut. If someone gets an unsatisfactory rating on these, it's clear that they have some severe issues in that area. What I would argue is missing, and we're going to talk about it a little later, is that this form, and if you have a form like this, I apologize in advance for picking on it throughout the day, but because there's no place for you to even write why you chose one of those scales, it becomes incredibly subjective. And that can cause problems later. It's not a problem if everybody's getting excellent number 1s on this form, then you're probably not going to get many complaints about it being not detailed enough. But when you have an issue like we're speaking about, where you want your evaluations to serve as evidence that you provided feedback for the person specific to their job, and then you perhaps move on to what we're going to talk about a little later, an improvement plan, this is incredibly insufficient. And I have a feeling in a hearing would probably be a cause of cross-examination, because there's no evidence here to back up this supervisor's feelings. And that's a piece we're going to go back to again and again. But that's the criterion-based model in its truest form. Simply the supervisor sitting down and reading the statement and making a decision. What the decision is based on, you don't know from this document. This looks like it's ours, so therefore we know it's perfect. No, I'm just kidding. This is what I would, an example of a narrative-based evaluation. So you can see again, as we talked about earlier, there are these broad statements. Describe the employee's performance of required duties. Doesn't tell you what the required duties are, so a supervisor just starts writing. So there's some good things and some bad things about this as well. Again, if the absent of a job description, or if the supervisor oversees a lot of jobs and doesn't specifically know all the parts of this job, there's a danger that they might focus in on some parts of the job and not all the parts of the job. So that's one danger with a narrative versus a criterion-based. You might actually miss large parts of the job. The flip side of that is if you're doing a narrative and you start to focus on things that you think are in the job description, but they're actually not, in which case you will probably get that brought to your attention by the employee, not without some embarrassment on your part. So the narrative is good because it allows you to be more expansive in your explanations, but than the criterion-based does, but it also puts the onus on the supervisor to really know the job description and make sure that they're giving feedback on all of those parts. You might imagine that when we write these, it's also easy, again, to be very subjective and not evidence-based and just give your opinions. And some of you might be saying, isn't that what we do when we give evaluations? We give our opinions, and having now sat through 7 APPR sessions in New York State regarding which 90% of the time is spent on evidence versus opinion, I can say that New York State clearly, at least for teachers' evaluations, believes that that's not what we're doing. We're not giving opinions. What we're doing is drawing conclusions based on the evidence we've gathered through our evaluations and through our time observing those individuals. You might think it's semantics. I might as well, but that is the direction, and there is no doubt that evidence is going to play a bigger role in our ability to clarify expectations and or issues with employees. So this is a narrative, an example of a narrative-based evaluation. The next one, which is probably small on your screen, it's definitely small on mine, is kind of an example of a hybrid, and there could be any number of hybrids out there between those two formats. This is just one that I thought was interesting. It kind of combines the first two. Different than our criterion-based evaluation we looked at, form that we looked at first from Cambridge. You can see that at least this one, on their 5-point scale, which is really actually a 6-point scale because there's a 0, at least gives an explanation of each rating. It's general, yes, but there is some explanation given. So that's better than the first one, than the Cambridge version. And it also allows, as you see down towards the bottom, not only to give a rating, but it also gives a comment section. So again, it will provide more detail than the criterion-based, and does make sure, if you do it this way, that you hit some of the key parts of the job every time by putting them in bolded items with comments.
And while we don't use the same format exactly in this district, we do have a practice where non-instructionally, anyone who gets below an average, it's mandatory really on the evaluation that we have comments, because you need to give the person the direction and the evidence of exactly how they're not meeting your expectations.
This continues to the second page of this evaluation. I thought it was important to put both because then it goes into a narrative assessment. So the first part, you can see how you could blend the two. I may have even skipped the page in between just for the purpose of this PowerPoint. But there might be several bulleted items on a hybrid to make sure that you hit them, but that you also have room to give comments, and then the narrative section that follows as well. Oops, sorry. There we go. So whether it's in the narrative or even in the hybrid that we just saw, it's really important that we have a discussion about the difference of evidence versus opinion. That's what the state's calling it. So we'll use those same terms. And I'm sure if you work in a school district, even if you're a school business official, like I'm sure most, if not all of you are, that you've still heard about the changes to the APPR laws in New York State. Just very briefly, the annual professional performance review is tied to the instructional staff, namely teachers and administrators, building administrators. It's not new in the sense that there were APPR laws on the books prior to this, although they weren't really very strict, and they were much different. When Race to the Top funds came out, New York State, like all states, that was right in the middle of our massive recession, and so any money was good money, and the Race to the Top funds were offered from the federal government to the states if they could incorporate. One of the things was incorporate a standardized evaluation system primarily focused on getting student academic achievement into the mix for teachers. New York State, like all states, jumped on that notion, not because they necessarily agree with it philosophically, but because they needed the money. And so they applied for that and did win Race to the Top funds, which meant that we were, in the school districts, were lucky enough to be given all new APPR laws to follow. And one of the things that, in addition to the test scores, was the notion that the performance evaluation of teachers would be based on rubrics. District was able to choose between several rubrics, but that no matter which rubric you used, the idea of gathering evidence when you go in and observe teachers versus giving opinions became a primary focus of retraining of all school building administrators. and that's the training I spoke of earlier. So we spend a great deal of time focused on that. And as I thought about this presentation today and my experiences dealing with Section 75s and those types of things, it really does make sense that what they're talking about for teachers is at least as important and maybe more important when it comes to non-instructional employees or employees who are covered under civil service law. So it may be a simple concept, but the reality is that if you, under this preview, I'm going to go back here. If under this annual evaluation at the bottom where it says comments, if you're writing very opinionated general statements that aren't backed up by evidence, it doesn't help you and your district or your labor relations specialist or your school attorney when you bring all this information to them because you want to move on to a disciplinary step, and it's all very vague and disputable because you didn't give facts or evidence. So what we're going to talk about very quickly is the importance of making sure that what you write on the evaluation, whether you have a criterion-based evaluation with a spot for you to write a summary, or whether it's a narrative, is that you start to focus your attention to evidence gathering before you come to any conclusion. And again, I hesitate to go to the next slide because you're going to say this is ridiculously easy. The only thing I can tell you is it is easy to watch us and see the difference. It's harder when you're busy, and it is a change of your mindset to get to do this on a regular basis. Perhaps if you were all put through 7 sessions of APPR training like I was, or the 3 more that I have, maybe if all business managers had to go through that, it wouldn't be a problem at all, because I think it's getting to me now. But so evidence versus opinion in a non-instructional arena might look like this. And again, it's simple. Evidence is clear, right? Mr. Smith has been on time every day over the past year. Ms. Wilson has emptied the trash in the science wing 5 times, has not emptied the trash in the science wing 5 times over the last 2 weeks. Very, very clear and able to be documented and proven. The GPS data shows that Mr. Hughes drove over the speed limit on 2 occasions in the last quarter. If you're lucky enough to have GPS like we do, we find that those kinds of things all the time, right? Interesting stuff you get from your GPS.
Amazing.
Helpful tool for sure. I'm not sure the drivers all love it, but we love it. But again, those are very specific pieces of evidence that you can use then to draw a conclusion. As opposed to, Mr. Smith is almost always late for his shift. Pretty vague. Miss Wilson is always forgetting to empty the trash. Again, now you're inserting subjectivity into this, and it can be disputed if you ever have to go down the line and deal with this in a more formal way. You don't want to be the one at the hearing saying, well, they always forget to empty the trash. And they say, that means every day? Well, almost always. Well, that means every day. Well, what does it mean? So the more specific you can be, the better. It's truly just getting in the mindset of saying, we need evidence. And for those of you who are business managers out there and say, well, I don't do these directly, this is something you should really stress with the supervisors who do the evaluations, that we need to get in this mindset of gathering specific evidence rather than using these subjective kinds of statements. Because I don't think it will help you, I know it won't help you, as you go forward in trying to discipline or remove a civil service employee. And the last one, Mr. Hughes is always safety conscious and a pleasure to work with. Well, that's a positive one, so you might be saying, what does that matter? Well, I think it's for consistency's sake. It makes sense that you use the same pattern of gathering evidence, whether it's a positive statement or a not positive statement or an area of correction. I would recommend that you do it both.
And I think one of the things that I find more difficult at times is usually the calls come to my office at the point somebody's fed up talking to someone, and then when we go back to the record, it doesn't reflect detail on anything. sometimes if it involves building personnel that may work with teachers, they're in principals, assistants, or aides, that nobody really wants to get anybody in trouble. There's been all kinds of informal conversations, but it's nothing that there's no dates, there's generalities. Well, we've talked about this before. Again, there needs to be some type of record if you're moving to the next step. So it's important at this step to identify things, so if you do have to move to what we'll talk about next, performance improvement plans, what you have here can be a help.
Yeah. What Marilyn just brought up is something I know that we all deal with, and it's always troubling. And I can tell you, as in personnel, we hear it a lot, both with teachers and non-instructional, and that's those informal conversations. Those are really deadly. They serve no purpose whatsoever. You might as well not even tell me you had them, because I can't use them for anything. So there's nothing worse than saying, well, yes, this is the only time I've mentioned it in an evaluation, but it was there the last 3 times I evaluated that person. I just didn't want to write it down. I wanted to give them a chance to correct it without it being written down.
Trying to work with them.
Well, don't tell me then. Tell me this is the first time you've seen it, because that means the same thing. So I think we can all appreciate that's a problem. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly was that if we think back again, I hope there's nobody from Cambridge out there, because I'm harping on this this evaluation system. But if you think about that first evaluation system, I'm just going to scoot back to it now that I know how to work this. If we scoot back to this one and look at it, again, here's the danger of this kind of evaluation, should you ever need it as part of your record to move on to a disciplinary hearing. If I put different points in there and some of them are low, and there's nowhere on here to list my evidence, either I have the evidence and I don't feel the need to keep it because nobody's asking for it right now, or I don't even have the evidence. Neither one is good. But you can imagine how, when we move forward in a disciplinary hearing, or if we move forward, handing this to a hearing officer is going to be met with a lot of concern, because you don't have, unless you've saved all that evidence somewhere else. And then, of course, the question will be, well, if you had all this evidence, what proof do we have that you shared it with the individual, because it's not on this evaluation form? So if you want them to get better, how did you share it? Well, I shared it with them verbally. That's a problem. So again, hate to harp on this evaluation system. It's one we see a lot of, but now that we're very clearly focused on gathering evidence, this one probably wouldn't suffice anymore. And if you have one of these in your district, it may be a point of some good conversation.
And if you look at the first 2 items, that's actually the one area where they've been given very clear, factual evidence on how you would get that rating, but the rest of them do not contain that.
By the way, if you have somebody in your district who is thinking that they might be interested in personnel, this presentation is probably a good way to get them to change their mind. It's amazing what we do. Any questions over there, Tracy? Fascinating, isn't it? Let's move on now to some more pieces related to evaluations, and then in a few minutes I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ellen, who's going to talk about performance improvement plans.
And I think I'm just going to interject here because we're up to the written reports. In the next 2 slides that Jeff's going to review, I just want to say that a lot of the principles that he's talking about will also apply to performance improvement plans. You're going to follow the same pattern with those.
Great. So let's look at some keys to a well-written report. In this case, it's an evaluation, but as Mary Ellen stated, it's really good for any written report that you're giving to an employee, including performance improvement plans. So you want to make sure, again, that you back up each part of your appraisal with clear evidence and a removal of all subjective language, or as much as you possibly can. And you want to make sure that you're backing that up with evidence. That's something I think I've harped on enough. You want to use uncomplicated language. That's true of anybody. That's not just true. I'm not saying that as a statement towards non-instructional employees. It's true of everybody. It's true of me when I get an evaluation from my superintendent. There really is no need to use any more language or any higher level language than to what you need to get your point across. So make sure that you use straightforward, uncomplicated language. And that's true when you're talking about both positive pieces of the write-up and negative. It doesn't need to be more difficult. Where improvement is needed, you need to make sure that you're giving clear direction with an attainable goal so that the employee has the opportunity to demonstrate improvement before the next evaluation. So you need to do that. I wrote down here in my notes, you need to do that even if it sounds silly. For instance, if we think of the example that I gave earlier of the bus driver with GPS that showed perhaps they were speeding a couple of times over the first quarter of the year. It might be, you might say, this is really silly that I would have to write a goal related to that, since the goal should probably just be follow the DMV laws. But again, if you want to use this as a way of moving forward in a discipline process, you don't want to leave any ambiguity at all. So if that's an area of concern, and if it happens, I certainly hope it is, then a statement such as, at the next review, I expect the GPS to show that you have never exceeded the speed limit between now and the next evaluation. It's very straightforward. It's easy to see whether or not they've attained that goal. So make sure that when you're writing up your evaluations, that where there are areas of improvement, that you are being very clear and putting forward attainable goals, that there can be no gray area as to whether or not they've achieved it or not.
I think also you need to keep in mind a balance with, if you have areas of concern along with the areas where the employee does great, you're going to have to make sure you don't gloss over the areas that are of concern because you value the other areas, but at the same time don't overemphasize the other areas too. Just be upfront on both and factual on both issues, and don't raise or lower either one.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we have is that most of us are generally nice people, I like to think, and that is a problem. It's never comfortable, except for some people, to go in and deliver lots of negative news. So sometimes people fall into the trap of feeling like they're obligated to write some good comments and maybe go over the top with that to soften the blow of the negative comments. And I think you can oversell each way, and I'm going to talk about that in my next slide a little bit. You don't want to oversell one way or the other. It's all about the evidence and the facts, and wherever that points you to. You shouldn't be afraid to give positive feedback if there's positive feedback to give. It doesn't weaken your case should you need to go forward with discipline related to those areas that are in need of improvement. It's not like you should be afraid to say that they're doing this and this and this well, because somehow that means that the areas of concern aren't areas of concern anymore. But at the same time, you don't want to soft pedal the difficult areas. You want to be straightforward and upfront on those. So let's go to the I keep hitting the wrong button. Let's go to the keys for an effective conference. The first one is that you need to plan for enough time so that the conference is not rushed. Again, one of the key pieces that you'll be asked in a hearing is what you've done to try to improve, to help that person improve. What has the district done? And although this may seem small, if they come in and they say, you know, they didn't go over every aspect of my report, I didn't hear that, I didn't see that, or I wanted to talk more and learn more, but the supervisor ran in and out of the room and just told me to sign it and I had to move on, you're opening yourself up to a lot of potential little glitches that you're going to have to work through that you wouldn't need to if you'd given the appropriate time. Unfortunately, you don't know how much time that ever is. Sometimes when I've planned for conferences, you plan 10 minutes and they go 40. Sometimes you plan for 40 and they go for 10. So there's no easy way to deal with that. matter of fact, to that point of showing the district's role in trying to improve someone, I want to read you one quick piece from Section 3020A, which again, regarding performance appraisals, which really focuses on teachers again, but I'm sure there's similar language in civil service, and I know from being in those hearings that the same question gets asked. So here it is. In Section 3020A, it says that the hearing officer shall consider the extent to which the employing board made efforts towards correcting the behavior of the employee, which resulted in charges being brought under this section. So, it's one of the key questions they're going to ask. What have you done? It is fair or unfair. It's our responsibility to show and demonstrate all the ways in which we've tried to give constructive criticism and help that person improve. And so, you need to plan for enough time in the conference so that you can't be accused of not giving that person the constructive criticism and the time they need to work through that and know where they need to go. Next is to go through every aspect of the report. So that means don't gloss over certain areas, don't jump around. Make sure that you've given each part of that report attention. Allow an interaction so that the employee has an opportunity to ask clarifying questions or even provide information which he or she thinks may be relative to your judgment. It's not a one-sided conversation, although it is important that you write your observation and then share that with the individual and give them time to share information with you as well. But you need to write the observation. I'm going to talk about that more in just a second. And I spoke about this before, so I won't go over it again. But again, don't fall into the trap of overselling in either direction. That's the point of that, removing that subjectivity. You don't need to oversell one way or another if you're providing accurate evidence. So there's no need to do an oversell one way in either direction. Here's the thing. Some people, when you go to your post-conference, some of you out there might handle this a few different ways. So I'm going to answer a question that's come up before and just give you my opinion. Some people say, well, I don't write the actual observation up completely until I meet with the employee and then hear from them. And there's some logic to that, obviously, that they might provide you with some information or some background that you might not have. But the pitfall in that is that can easily lead to a process where you're almost co-writing the person's evaluation. If you stop putting your own thoughts down and wait for them to come in and you kind of come to a mutual agreement before you sign. And I've seen districts who do that start to head in that direction, and that can become dangerous because ultimately the supervisor is the one responsible for providing the feedback. So my recommendation would be that at the post-conference you always have, the supervisor always has his or her comments written out completely. And then if there is information that comes up in the post-conference, there should be normally an area on the evaluation where either the employer or the supervisor can write some summary comments as it relates just to the post-conference. So at the post-conference, I learned this and this and this. Or there's also almost always a spot for the employee to write comments as well. That's the better way. Now, the next question on the next page kind of talks about that a little more. If the employee brings new information to light that I was not aware of, what are my options, obligations for including this in my evaluation? Well, again, as I mentioned, you could put it in the summary, in a section of a summary that you have available to you, talk about what you learned in the post-conference. If it's going to affect that person's score up above, and it's something that you believe you can verify, and it's not just their opinion, then I think you do take that into consideration and maybe change your score. But I would say that before you do that, you have to check to verify that the information they're providing you with is precise. If they're telling you that the reason why they didn't take the garbage out those 5 days was because your supervisor told you, your immediate supervisor told you not to because so-and-so was going to do it, then obviously you can go back and verify that. And if they did have that information, then that might change your opinion on this situation with that employee. It might raise a question with your supervisor, but that's something that might cause you to change, and you certainly have the right to do that. But short of that, if it's just their opinion, I disagree with you, and here's all the reasons why I disagree with you, I would recommend, obviously, that you stick to your evaluation, and you're free, or they're free to write in their section that they disagree with you for the following reasons. So I think that's a little bit of your call.
Yeah. Would it be incumbent on you if somebody writes a counter opinion? How much do you really need to respond to that? And I guess I'll use the example of someone who says, well, the baskets aren't always that full, so I don't think it's necessary to empty them every night. Do you have to respond back if they're writing that type of opinion?
I think if that comes up in the conversation, then certainly you're going to respond to it, because it's a teachable moment, if you will, to say
Right.
That's not your judgment call to make. Your job description says this. You do it whether there's a piece of garbage in there or it's full. However, when it comes time and they decide not to talk about that, but they decide to write that as an issue, I don't think you're obligated at all. It's my opinion that can go on forever, first of all, and you respond and they respond. But that's not the reason why they're given a chance to respond. They're given a chance to respond to be somewhat so noted kind of thoughts. It's not something that I would take a lot of time responding to. I think that can just waste a lot of important time. Again, if it comes up in the conversation, that's a better place for it to occur. And that might be in your summary evaluation, although employee X noted that oftentimes they aren't very full and they thought it would be a better use of time not to sell them. I reiterated to them that they are to be changed every night. That's our procedure, and we expect it to be done. But I wouldn't, if they start writing things back and forth. We see that more commonly. I know we're not going to talk about counseling memos, but we see it more commonly during counseling memos when they write a big formal response.
Mm-hmm.
And I would never respond to a response because it'll just go on forever. Even at times if it's hard to do that because they've written some things that are just not true. The next common question, if I know that this evaluation is not going to be well received, should I have an association representative present? Again, that's your call. It kind of depends on what your protocol has been in the district. However, I don't think we use association representatives in that way. So I would recommend, my answer here at FM would be no. Remember that the only time a person is entitled to have an association representative present is when we are recommending or pursuing disciplinary action. Oftentimes in district, we've moved that bar or that line to the advantage of the association, and we may have had very good reasons for doing that. But when we do that, then we set up a new protocol that we really need to follow, and we don't want to do that if we don't have to. So I wouldn't recommend using an association rep for this purpose, because then what you've done is you've opened up the door to say that association reps really should be there every time you do a post-conference for an evaluation, no matter who it is. That, first of all, I don't know how you'd ever schedule all of that. I don't know how the association rep, who's probably one of your employees, would have the time to do all that. But see, once you move that bar, then someone else can say, well, you had them there the last time. So now you're making a judgment as to whether or not you think it's going to go well or not. So I would recommend certainly not doing that. Here at FM, we don't do it for that, but we have moved the bar a little bit through the years, and I think most districts have, to have a union rep offer to be present, or an association rep, offer them the opportunity to come to a meeting that involves any write-up that we might use later to pursue disciplinary action. So that means in counseling memos, sometimes we might have an association representative present or offer that. I don't think that's a good practice either, but we do it often, and we have to be aware of that. However, I will say that we have to all remember that, and I think we often make this mistake, that it's not for the district to invite an association representative to one of these meetings, any of these, including disciplinary meetings that are going to result in recommendation for disciplinary action. It's not our job to invite them, and in fact, I would argue that we might be slightly unethical, if not downright, it might be illegal, for us to go to the association rep directly and ask them to come to a meeting, in which case we're going to tell them information about, confidential information about an employee. The proper way to do that is to make sure that the employee knows that they have the right to bring an association representative to the meeting, and it's their job to contact the association rep and bring that association rep to the meeting. And some of them may choose to do that, and some may choose not to, and they might have very good reasons. They don't get along with the union. Sometimes they're embarrassed by what this is about. And so if they are embarrassed by something that came up and they're willing to accept the counseling memo and ready to accept it, and they walk in and suddenly they have an association president sitting there that they did not know was going to be there, I would say that we've overstepped our bounds.
And we have had that happen before where we've tried to free up the association president's schedule to attend. We haven't not informed the employee ahead of time, but the employee is requested because some of our bargaining units are full of various personalities and cliques, and they've said no, they don't want that individual there, and they've opted for another representative within. We don't let them just bring anyone, but they have several representatives that they can choose from, and they will choose someone else.
Yeah, the other thing I'll mention is that sometimes districts start to invite the association rep because the association president, for instance, is a really reasonable person, and you have a good relationship with them. But I would just warn that the downside of that is that that person may not be the president of the union forever, probably won't. And so now you've set a practice up of allowing people into meetings that they really shouldn't be allowed into because they were helping you, and you could come back after a summer break with a union representative who is not as reasonable, and the minute you start to say, well, now I don't want you in those meetings, is the minute they're going to say, you've always allowed the association president into these meetings, and now you're stuck with someone who's very difficult when you didn't have to have them there. So just remember that if you have a great association president right now, wait 2 years and you might not any longer. We're going to move on quickly because I see we're getting under early.
I'm just going to quickly interject one thing on evaluations. I mentioned we have a frequency of once a year. For our new hires, we do and we have a reminder set up from the business office to the supervisors. We do a midpoint evaluation. So if there are areas of concern, the individual has an opportunity to improve before their 2 weeks, 2 weeks and they're off probation. And then we do it again just before the end of probation. That's it. It's worked very well for us.
And we're also in the ISO school, which there are very few, ISO was 9,000 we're on.
Yes.
There aren't many school districts that use that, but that you've seen that on businesses all over the place in the industry. But that also has very strict rules and guidelines for evaluation of employees, observation and feedback. Here, although it's not in our contract, we do have fairly strict guidelines to follow in terms of observations and evaluation of our employees because of that credential. Moving on quickly to improvement plans. One of the questions that comes up, and we were asked not to, we weren't asked not to, but we were asked to speak about improvement plans, not counseling memos. Again, Eric Wilson spoke to counseling memos earlier in the year, but there is a connection between the two. There's often some confusion about when you would go to a counseling memo versus an improvement plan. So, very quickly, there's a lot of gray area here, so bear with us. But the counseling memo typically addresses a single incident or concern, and it's usually an immediate incident and concern. It came up quickly. It needs to be addressed immediately. And it might be work performance related or job related. But it could also be a violation of the rules or insubordination or many, many things, not just a part of the work that's not being done appropriately. So any of those could result in a counseling memo, insubordination, violation of rules, work performance. But a performance improvement plan oftentimes can address multiple deficiencies or a repeated concern that's come up many times. And it is almost exclusively related to work performance issues, not insubordination or violation of rules. That usually doesn't apply for a performance improvement plan. As a quick example, I was talking to our labor relations specialist this morning and told him I was doing this, and I asked him for his interpretation, and he agreed with that interpretation, but he said the perfect example is if you have an employee who's caught smoking on your property during a break, and even if it happens multiple times, you're not going to put together a performance improvement plan for them to stop smoking on your property. They're not going to need any retraining on that. They just need to stop. So the more likely scenario for that would be a counseling memo into perhaps a letter of reprimand into perhaps moving to disciplinary proceedings. Whereas a performance improvement plan would be more likely if you have work performance issues where it appears that, by focusing in on those and helping someone focus in on those areas and perhaps provide training, they could actually improve in that area. And so that's kind of some of the key differences between the two. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ellen now to talk about a little bit more about the purpose of the performance improvement plan.
Really, to start off, it's summed up below in more detail, but really the whole point is to help the employee be successful on the job. You're going to provide them a specific plan of action to improve their performance in the areas that you've identified. You're going to establish measurable goals and specific time frames to reach those goals. You're going to develop a schedule to provide feedback and discuss their progress. So you're not just going to meet and it's going to be over with. You've got to give them feedback during the process. And you're also going to, in that plan, identify resources and training that the district is going to provide. That would be more our responsibility in this whole plan. It shouldn't be approached as a way to fire somebody, keeping in mind that long term, if the goals aren't met, the performance improvement plan may be a part of the documentation you use if you take disciplinary action. And ideally, when you do a performance improvement plan, is a judgment call. You may have repeated verbal counselings that we know are really, unless they've been identified specifically, it's a matter of they aren't taking those verbal hints. Now you're going to start with a process that's more formal. You may have identified improvements in the evaluation, but there's no improvement, or maybe need to improve in an evaluation. And hopefully you're doing it prior to the point where you're totally fed up with the individual, and it's just a positive way to work through it with them. Ideally, it's going to occur prior to discipline. It's not a part of discipline, and if you look at progressive actions, this is really the step you take before you move to discipline. That said, you could always have an extreme circumstance where there was an incident that warranted discipline, but as an outcome of that, you may also be doing a performance improvement plan if it's warranted. This slide is just a template that you can use. It's really got all the key areas in it. You can use different headings. I suppose to some degree these could maybe be seen a little harsh with the identified deficiency or the example of deficiency. But don't change it up for just one particular individual. Whatever you decide is right, whether it's identified deficiency, area of concern, just make sure you're consistent in all your performance improvement plans, which are hopefully few and far between. In your introduction, you're going to make sure and have these areas in there: the employee name, their job title, how long they've been in that job. You may also want to include the years in the district if they've had more than one job. The supervisor's name, the specific purpose of the performance improvement plan, and the consequences if the goals aren't met. And we've got an example here where we've given an introduction. The purpose is to provide a framework to improve the performance. And it's listing the details about the individual and as you get down below, this particular example is something that's a follow-up to an evaluation. So an evaluation has occurred, there's been areas identified of concern, and there's really not improvement from that evaluation process. So now you're going to this more formal and more detailed plan. And at the bottom, it closes out with noting that if he hasn't corrected the weaknesses to a satisfactory degree, then disciplinary action up to and including termination can be taken. And that's the more general, but now you're going to move forward to the specifics. And you're going to start out with a general statement of the area. The next two, this slide and the next slide, well, we're going on to, is going to have some specific, it's got two different areas that have been identified. This one has to do with safety, and it's listed specific occurrences that have happened and what the concerns were. It's also noting these have happened after April 1st, but it's noting that the evaluation identified similar concerns on April 1st. So all of these are subsequent occurrences since he's been already advised about this.
If I could just for a minute, the examples of deficiency are clearly look at the dates, how specific that is, the dates that it happened in the evidence. Now that's when you don't want to get into saying the examples are, back in April you had this problem and that. It's very clear how specific and the kinds of records they had to keep, hopefully through the evaluations, but however they kept them, they had very specific information to back up what they're claiming to be a deficiency. And
that is what everybody who's working with the deficiencies should be on board with, the fact that there's a concern, there's repetitive problems, and you need to start detailing whether it's from complaints or whatever. And this is another area where this particular employee is having issues. And again, it's listing not all waste baskets in your areas are emptied at times. And then it's got most recently you did not empty the baskets, and it's got a date. And if you follow through on the others, there's a couple other examples. Now, when we get into the next slide, which is suggestions for improvement, typically these are going to follow right after the area. You're going to keep your sections all together, but you're going to follow each deficiency with what the improvements are. And again, Jeff mentioned earlier, even with an evaluation, some of it may be seen very obvious, but you need to make the statement, empty all waste baskets in your area every night. So you have to make simple statements like that. And you need to make sure when you look at those statements that you develop, you're going to say, how am I going to measure this improvement? And it's going to clearly be obvious what the measurement is. Give any support that the person's going to receive, whether it's checklist, priority list, training. If they're varied timelines, note the specifics in the individual area so that they know when they're supposed to make that improvement. And I think if you have outcomes that are measurable in that, you're going to get into less arguments. The more detail you are, the less there is to argue because you've wrapped it all into one piece. And the training is an essential part of it. If you've got somebody who's struggling and they need to improve, you've got to give them the tools to do it. And these are just examples which you could read through later in more detail. But again, we've identified earlier that there were safety concerns. So now we've told the employee specifically what they need to do with following instructions for using various chemicals. And on top of that, we've added a statement. Even though we've given them what needs to improve, we're making arrangements. We've already got the date made up. where we're going to provide them training from a safety officer. Second is the job skills. Again, we've talked about a checklist. When you're doing things like this, depending on the level of the position, if you have a custodial helper or that, you're going to need to make sure that what you develop as a checklist is something that will be useful to the person if they have reading difficulties. And then we've set up a component to kind of wrap it in with the supervisor, telling them if they're not able to complete their daily tasks, they need to notify the supervisor. And then the supervisor can evaluate the situation. And we've also added that the supervisor will be working with the individual on training for cleaning the floors and preventing buildup in corners. So they're going to be giving them the techniques, even if it's been done before, now you're identifying it. Then you're going to summarize everything that you've talked about in the plan. You're going to conclude with an overall time frame. You're going to indicate how often you're going to meet. For something like this, it's more routine, so you may only have one midpoint meeting to discuss what the progress is, if the person's making improvements as you expect, and then all the parties are going to sign. And you're also going to have an end date on that of when all the improvements are expected to be completed by. And we have an example next of a summary where we've got the supervisor inspecting the area periodically during the process. Additionally, for the final conclusion, the superintendent of buildings and grounds is going to complete an inspection of the area to determine if it meets the district standards. And we've also we utilize a standard inspection form in our district that the building supervisors use, and they spot check periodically using the same form, different areas. So I would attach that to this because those are the areas we're going to be looking at and rating, so the individual will understand what's going to be involved in that inspection. And then we've given a deadline that it's going to be accomplished by June 30th. We've got the date that this was reviewed and the signatures. And then, back one. I've got a few more minutes.
You're doing great. We've
got follow-up, which is maybe one of the areas, especially when things are going the way we've had planned, that we may relapse a little on, and it's critical to have the follow-up. You're going to have to do it within the established time frames. Even though you may be giving feedback ongoing, I mentioned there should be at least one midpoint review of how things are going. At the end of the established time frame, you're going to determine the employee's progress, and there's different outcomes that could be possible. Could be their expectations are met. Could be they've made significant progress, so you don't really want to move to discipline, but they aren't really where you want them to be. So you can extend it, but you need to identify that, you need to write it up, and you need to determine how long you're extending it for. And then it could be just it's unacceptable where you're at, and you're going to move to that next step. And along with that, if the employee has met the goals, you're still going to want to meet with them again. And you're going to want to make sure and tell them, along with the positive feedback, that you state that the progress they achieved must be maintained. And you want to make sure that they understand that. It's not going to go away just because they've reached the expectations. You're going to want to follow up your meeting in writing. The immediate supervisor, you should be on board with him that they're going to provide the continued support and give the employee feedback. And in the next performance review that's regularly scheduled, if there's nothing that's going on in between time, you're still going to want to reference back and note that they're continuing to meet expectations. Or if they're backsliding a little, you're going to want to make sure and identify that it's cropping up again. And I think that's, let's see, no. Yeah, the only other thing, keep in mind when you've got somebody who's made the achievements, if you don't follow up in writing and then they do backslide down the road, then you're going to have a missing piece in that whole plan, and that's going to present an issue when you're dealing with the backsliding because you've never had that follow-up in writing. And last, I've just done up a checklist that incorporates what all the different things that we've talked about. So this is just something that you could utilize if you are doing performance improvement, that you've covered all the things that we've just discussed.
Great.
And I don't see any questions.
We have some questions that Mike gives, right?
Right, we do.
So there are a few questions from our friend Mike up in Oswego.
Right.
So since we have a little bit of time, we'll go through these questions as well. Certainly, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get them in now. So the first question that Mike asked was, to what degree should the union be up to speed and involved in discussions leading up to a performance improvement plan? We talked about this earlier. I think a lot of that has to do with the relationship you have with your union. But at the end of the day, I think we need to remember what the law is. And the law says that technically they don't have a right to know any of that unless the employee wants them to know it. Now, if the employee tells them that I received a poor evaluation and I'm concerned about it, you probably will get a call from that union representative to talk about it, but it won't come from you. Technically, I don't know as though they have a right to know which employees are on the verge of getting a performance improvement plan unless the employee is the one who's giving them that information. Now, having said that, I know that's not the way it is in practice a lot. If you have a good relationship with an association rep, it sometimes makes sense to keep that relationship strong by off the record sharing some information to keep them in the loop. Certainly something I do a lot here, but it does depend on that takes a level of trust that you have with the association rep, and you don't want to get caught in a bad situation if it's a new rep and you don't know as though you have that kind of relationship yet.
I guess I'll throw in an odd in between, which is if you are getting to that midpoint and it's really looking grim as far as the improvements and you're getting really concerned that you are going to wind up by the end having to take discipline, would you think maybe at that point you might, at the midway point, you might want to, or are we making an assumption of failure then?
I think it's probably case dependent. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
It really does depend on the relationship you have with the association rep and also what your past practice has been in your district. If it's a district that whenever there is a performance improvement plan written, the rep has always been there, then you really need to consider what the practice has been and stick with that. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to treat it differently than other times and then go forward into a hearing if you have to end up doing that and have any spots where they can say, you didn't dot your I and cross your T's, or you did something slightly different this time, which leads us to believe that this person was at a disadvantage over somebody else. So it really is case dependent. The next one is, have you encountered a hostile reaction to a performance improvement plan by an employee? I have not. That's not to say they're excited about a performance improvement plan, but I haven't encountered a hostile reaction, although I'm sure some people out there listening may have. I would argue that if you get a hostile reaction, then you're dealing with a different issue, and that's one of potential insubordination. Usually, again, a performance improvement plan wouldn't be written due to insubordination. It would be written towards something related to the job itself. And so you might have a new issue to discuss through a counseling memo, perhaps, if they have a hostile reaction, depending on how hostile that is. The other thing to remember is that you have the authority and the right to end a meeting at any time you feel uncomfortable, which I've done, not in relationship to a performance improvement plan, but to other meetings when I've just said, obviously you're upset, this isn't helpful, and we will set up a new meeting time. Sometimes they calm down right away because it's a show, and so then they don't want to have to go through this all again, and they'd rather just finish, so they calm down. I had that happen as early as last year. And sometimes they are too upset to deal with it at the time, and they are better after they've had some time to process the information.
And I think two factors that can help reduce a hostile reaction from somebody, or even being very argumentative, is before the meeting, they should understand what the meeting's about. When you schedule it, they need to know what the topic is. They shouldn't walk into the room and be blindsided by it. And the other thing is, the topics that you're discussing pretty much shouldn't be a surprise to them, because somehow they should have been getting corrections verbally from their supervisor. There should have been other feedback happening first. So all those things, I've had people come in and it's kind of like, well, yeah, I've known this was coming, so I don't know why they didn't improve beforehand, but...
Next question. Could the employee grieve, and what might be the likely outcome? Well, the employee grievance, it depends on a couple of things. Number one, it could be a grievance if, obviously, it'd have to be a violation of something in the contract. So some contracts do have specific language as to the process for a performance improvement plan. So therefore, if you didn't follow a process or the like, I could see where they could grieve it there. But short of that, or you asking for something in the performance improvement plan which causes them to have to do something above and beyond their normal workday, short of those kinds of things, I can't think of when a grievance would apply here. So therefore, and I think, in those cases, I think the likely outcome would be simple. For instance, if in your performance improvement plan, you require someone to meet with you monthly, and those meetings are outside of their contract day, I would think they would be able to grieve that. They're not really grieving the performance improvement plan itself. They're grieving the fact that you're asking them to do something that is contractually not allowable. In which case, I think, what would the outcome be? Well, the outcome would probably be, in that case, that you could simply change the part of the performance improvement plan that's causing the grievance. You wouldn't have to throw out the entire performance improvement plan. The only time I could see it really applying to a grievance related specifically to the whole performance improvement plan is if you have that in your contract and you're not following the process or procedure or format that is required in your contract. If you don't have it in your contract at all, then I think you have the right to do it.
Make sure you never let it in your contract.
Exactly. I think you have the right to do that. The one thing I wanted to mention about performance improvement plans quickly is that, again, and I apologize, but going into the teacher realm, part of the new law in APPR is that a draft be written of a teacher improvement plan, and that the individual and the association have the ability to be part in the final product. I wouldn't give that up so quickly in the non-instructional realm until they make us. But at the same time, it does make perfect sense if the goal, again, is to help this person improve and everybody should be on the same page. That is the goal. You want the person at the end of the year to be successful in achieving those goals. So it makes sense that you might come in with a draft of a performance improvement plan, but certainly listen to the individual, and if they have recommendations and suggestions that you believe make sense, this is a time when I'd say it definitely would make sense to add it, because it just adds more fuel to the fire if they don't meet it, if you will. If you're able to say clearly, some of these recommendations came directly from them, from the individual. So the additional training we provided, the meetings with this other person, the frequent meetings with the supervisor were all part of the dialogue that we agreed would be useful. And so I wouldn't say that's a bad thing to do in an improvement plan if they're able to adhere to kind of what would make sense versus trying to blame somebody else for the problem.
And I think when you talk about their directions for improvement, because you want this to be a little interactive at least with them, and I think when you get to the improvement stage, if they haven't had any comments or that, I think that's a perfect opportunity to talk to them. You may have a plan, but you may want to throw out the question to them, is there something else that we can do
Right.
for you that will assist you in improving? Or leave it open for them if they come up with ideas that they can bring them forward.
Because remember, half the battle of removing somebody through the processes that we're required to use are, as I mentioned before in Section 3020A, half of the battle is showing all the things that, part of it is clearly identifying where the problem is and having evidence to show that. The other part that's really important is to make sure that we show all the things that we've done as a district to try and help that person improve and come back. So there's no shortcuts to that. We have to do it. Some people might think that's crazy that we would have to do that, but we do. And we could just as easily lose in a hearing because we didn't do all that we could do there. So asking them other ideas that they have that we could do. Obviously, they say send me to California for training. You could say no. But they may have some very good ideas on what might help them, and that'll either get to the goal of that person moving back to their job successfully, or it will help build a stronger case if you go to hearing. Very quickly, last two questions, then we're going to wrap it up. What shortcomings in an improvement plan could cause trouble in the event of a challenge? Well, I think one of the biggest is what we just talked. Well, again, not clarifying clearly what the problem is, showing that you have the evidence to back it up, not providing them with lots of opportunities to show improvement and to help them with that improvement. And then the last piece, I think, would be not having a clear goal at the end of it. That would be a big mistake. If you don't have a clear outcome, that the person knows specifically what you're looking for, and that's what they're going to be judged on. If it's vague, then it's going to be another judgment call at the end of this, and I think you don't want to be there. So I think those are where you might find a challenge. I think I met the goal, you think I didn't. Well, that's because the goal wasn't clear. The last one, it is expected that the employee would or should wish to provide a written response to the improvement plan to become part of the record, similar to the way they may have for a counseling memo. Again, it's a little bit different process. I'd have to ask you to consult your attorneys to find out whether or not they have that right. I'm not aware that they have that right as it relates to a performance improvement plan, but I could be wrong. I've never seen it. Counseling memo, absolutely. But again, if you're allowing them opportunity to give some input into how that is, the final document is written, then they really shouldn't have a need to write a response. You could, in fact, if you wanted to, give them an area to write a summary, a question or a statement. I don't feel I need this, whatever they might say. But at the end of the day, it's your call. And I don't know of any legal requirement. Of course, we're not lawyers, but I don't know of any legal requirement to give them the opportunity to write a response to a performance improvement plan. If there are any last questions, we'll gladly take them. If you are asleep, I'm sure your secretary will wake you up when it's time to leave for the day. We hope we didn't bore you too much. And Mike, we appreciate the opportunity to do this for your organization, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much as well. If anyone has any final questions, please feel free to use the chat pane to the right of the main screen, or hit 7# on your phone. We'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, we have no questions. Jeff, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you for attending. Have a great day and a great weekend.
Thanks, Mike.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.